At 7:14 local time, the South China Sea looks exactly like a body of water that 5 separate nations have claimed as their exclusive sovereign territory, which is to say it looks like open ocean, featureless and indifferent to the geopolitical opinions of everyone who has ever filed a claim on it. The sky is overcast. Visibility is 8 nautical miles. Somewhere to the west, the outline of the Spratly Islands is a low smudge on the horizon, which is approximately what the international legal standing of China's territorial claims in this area also looks like from most angles. A low smudge that becomes more defined the closer you get, and considerably less coherent the more carefully you examine it. USS Benfold, hull number DDG-65, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, is making 11 knots on a freedom of navigation track that the 7th Fleet has been running through this area for 3 consecutive decades because international maritime law is not a suggestion, and the United States Navy is how the United States Navy expresses that view. The watch section came on at 6 o'clock. The morning brief noted 7 points of interest. 4 were routine. 2 were weather-related. 1 was a cluster of 43 vessels, approximately 18 nautical miles to the northeast, that the Intelligence Digest had flagged with a notation that, in the dry language of fleet intelligence products, translated roughly as, "These are not fishing boats, but they are going to tell you they are fishing boats, and the performance will be committed." On the bridge, the officer of the deck is tracking the cluster. He has seen this before. The entire 7th Fleet has seen this before. The cluster has a name in the intel community, a file number, a historical pattern of behavior, and a documented relationship with the People's Liberation Army Navy that is approximately as subtle as a submarine surfacing at a yacht club. He is watching 43 vessels that are, according to their automatic identification system transponders, engaged in commercial fishing operations in international waters. He is watching them with the same professional skepticism he applies to everything in this part of the ocean, which is considerable, because everything in this part of the ocean has a second explanation. He picks up his coffee. It is good coffee. The Benfold's mess has a functional espresso machine, a fact that has done more for morale on this deployment than any other single piece of equipment aboard. He drinks. He watches the cluster. The cluster watches back, in the sense that 19 of the 43 vessels are pointing bow on toward USS Benfold's projected track, which is not what fishing boats do when they are fishing. This is the setup. The punchline has been operating out of Sanya Naval Base for approximately 4 years. The concept behind China's maritime militia is one of the more creative pieces of operational design in the modern era, and it deserves a moment of genuine analytical respect before we explain precisely why it was not going to work on this particular Tuesday morning. The People's Liberation Army Navy recognized correctly that direct military confrontation with U.S. surface forces in open water produces outcomes that even the most optimistic PLA assessment directorate finds difficult to characterize as favorable. The solution was not to build better ships, though they are doing that too, but to populate the South China Sea with vessels that are legally, on paper, commercially registered fishing and maritime support craft, crewed by personnel who are, on paper, civilian mariners operating under, on paper, civilian maritime law. The vessels communicate on military frequencies. They maneuver in military formations. They report to military command structures. They carry out military tasking. But the paperwork says fishing. This creates a specific kind of problem for a U.S. Navy destroyer operating under rules of engagement that were written entirely correctly to prevent military force against civilian vessels. Before USS Benfold can treat these vessels as the military assets they functionally are, the rules require positive classification, evidence of hostile intent or capability that meets a specific legal threshold. The fishing boats know this. The command structure behind the fishing boats knows this. The classification requirement is the operational mechanism that makes the entire concept work, arrive in sufficient numbers, position appropriately, and the ROE constraint does some of the work that actual military capability cannot. Which brings us to 722 and the beginning of the part of the story where things get interesting. The 43-vessel cluster had been making 7 knots toward USS Benfold's projected track since approximately 6:30. By 722, the lead elements were close enough that USS Benfold's bridge team could read the vessel names on the hulls. The vessels were, and this detail is worth holding for a moment, painted in the blue and white color scheme of the China Coast Guard, which is itself not a fishing organization, overlaid with the name Boards of Registered Commercial Fishing Operators out of Hainan Province. The effect was the maritime equivalent of someone showing up to a business meeting wearing a suit with a name tag that says, "Definitely not a lawyer." The AIS transponders were broadcasting commercial fishing vessel identification codes. The bridge-to-bridge radio was carrying routine commercial traffic in Mandarin, discussing, among other things, catch reports. There were demonstrably no fish. The nets were stowed. The fishing equipment was present in the way that furniture in a model home is present, for appearance, not function. The officer of the deck logged the composition, bearing, and formation geometry. He called the tactical action officer. The tactical action officer called the executive officer. The executive officer looked at the plot, looked at the clock, and said 4 words that were not a question. How long until classification? Here is the vulnerability that nobody planned for. Not the Benfold's crew, and certainly not the 43 vessels converging on her track. At 7:19, 3 minutes before the lead elements reached visual identification range, the Benfold's SPS-73 surface search radar, the navigation and surface warfare radar that complements the primary SPY-1D array, had transitioned to a scheduled maintenance calibration cycle. The SPY-1D was fully operational. The fire control systems were fully operational. But the SPS-73 provides the specific close-in surface track data that populates the situational awareness picture used for the ROE documentation process. And for 9 minutes, the standard calibration window, the close-in surface picture was being reconstructed from SPY-1D data alone, which works but requires additional processing time to resolve the contact separation geometry on 43 vessels at close range. 9 minutes. 43 vessels at 7 knots, 8 nautical miles out at 7:22, closing to approximately 6 nautical miles by the time SPS-73 came back online. The lead vessels would be within the first threshold of the ROE classification sequence by 7:28. The SPS-73 would restore at 7:28. The margin was, again, a coincidence. The coincidence was, again, real. Short sentences. Because this is where it matters. The tactical action officer was aware. The commanding officer was in CIC by 7:24, standing at the display with the specific stillness of a senior officer who is processing information and has not yet decided which of the several available options is the least inconvenient. The plot showed 43 vessels in 3 loose, concentric arcs ahead of the Benfold's track. The lead arc, 9 vessels, was in what any honest assessment would call an intercept geometry, positioned to force a course alteration by making the straight-line track operationally uncomfortable. The middle arc, 22 vessels, was positioned to close behind if the Benfold altered course. The outer arc, 12 vessels, was running a parallel track approximately 2 nautical miles to the south. The formation was not accidental. It was not fishing. It was, in the technical language of maritime maneuvering, a box. A very slow box, crewed by people with excellent paperwork. SPS-73 restore time, the commanding officer said. 4 minutes, sir. 4 minutes. The lead vessels were at 7 nautical miles and closing. What's our classification confidence on the lead 9? High, sir. Formation geometry. Communication intercepts. Command and control signatures. We assess maritime militia. But the documentation threshold requires SPS-73 surface track data for the formal classification package. 4 minutes. Yes, sir. He looked at the display for 3 seconds. Then, come left 15 degrees. Reduce to 8 knots. A course alteration and speed reduction, enough to open the geometry with the lead arc without exiting the freedom of navigation track corridor, without providing the visual of a U.S. destroyer turning away from the formation, and without conceding anything that needed to be conceded. A professional adjustment that said, in the language of ship handling, that USS Benfold was aware of the geometry and was in no particular hurry to let it develop on anyone else's schedule. The lead arc adjusted. 7 of the 9 vessels turned to maintain intercept geometry. The formation was responsive. The formation was coordinated. The formation was, in the specific way this mattered, for the ROE documentation package, continuing to demonstrate exactly the pattern that the classification criteria required. At 7:28, the SPS-73 came back online. The surface picture resolved across 43 contacts in approximately 11 seconds. The classification package, which had been building from SPY-1D data and communication intercepts since 7:22, received its final required data input. The formal ROE documentation threshold was met at 7:29. The tactical action officer looked at his display. The commanding officer looked at his display. Neither of them reached for a weapons release authorization. Because the point of the ROE framework is not that you immediately employ every authorized option the moment the threshold is crossed. The point is that you have those options documented, available, and the entity on the other side of the threshold knows it. Knowing that the classification package is complete changes the geometry of the interaction in ways that are invisible on a navigation plot, but very visible to the command structure behind 43 vessels that have been watching USS Benfold's electronic emissions since 6:30. Now, the thing about 43 vessels operating as a coordinated maritime militia formation is that they are not, regardless of their organizational sophistication, invisible. They are, in fact, remarkably loud. Every vessel in the formation was emitting. AIS transponders, standard commercial units, broadcasting on international frequencies, bridge-to-bridge radio, commercial maritime VHF, unencrypted, conducting what was ostensibly routine fishing coordination, but was, to anyone listening with any sophistication, a real-time command and control net describing USS Benfold's course, speed, and maneuvering responses in terminology that no fishing coordination net has any reason to use. Radar emissions from the lead vessels, navigation radar consistent with the specific units installed on the Type 2-209 Maritime Militia Vessel class, which the AN/SLQ-32 Electronic Warfare Suite had cataloged across 11 previous encounters in this area, and could identify with the same confidence it would apply to a contact it had seen yesterday, which it had, literally yesterday. The intelligence warfare officer in the EW space was not watching the formation through the periscope camera. He was watching his collection screens with the focused intensity of someone who is approximately 3 minutes from completing a data set he has been building for 4 months. The formation's internal command net, not the bridge-to-bridge fishing coordination theater, the actual command net running below it on a frequency the SLQ-32 had identified during the third encounter with this specific unit in August, was transmitting. The transmissions were encrypted. The encryption was not American-grade military encryption. It was commercial-grade encryption of the type used by various organizational communication systems, which is adequate against casual interception and not adequate against a collection suite that had been mapping its specific characteristics since the first time this formation deployed 6 months ago. "We have the command net again," the intelligence warfare officer reported. "Same encryption package as August. We're getting the metadata, transmission patterns, timing, origination signatures." He paused. "They've added a vessel. Formation composition is 43 today versus 40 in the last encounter. 3 new units operating in the outer arc. Different radar emission signature on 2 of the 3. Looks like an upgraded navigation radar fit." The petty officer next to him flagged the new signatures into the collection log. Link 16 began packaging the updated formation profile. 5th Fleet in Yokosuka would have the new vessel identifications and the upgraded radar fit data before USS Benfold cleared the contact area. Pacific Fleet Intelligence in Pearl Harbor would have it by the afternoon brief. The formation that had deployed to assert presence and complicate a U.S. freedom of navigation operation was simultaneously providing the U.S. Navy with an updated order of battle. 3 new vessel identifications, a radar upgrade profile, and a command net transmission pattern accurate enough to use for future geolocation. They had arrived to box in a destroyer. They were leaving as a research contribution. "Are they actually using the same command net frequency they used in August?" the executive officer asked. "Same frequency, ma'am. Same encryption. We've been collecting against it for 4 months. And they don't know we have the frequency. They know we have collection capability. They don't know which specific frequencies we've isolated." A pause. "Or apparently they don't, because they're still using it." The executive officer noted this in her log. The note was brief. Some observations don't need elaboration. Here is the thing about the fishing boat performance that is genuinely, technically, almost admirable in its ambition. The China Maritime Militia concept requires the adversary to either accept the presence of 43 vessels maneuvering aggressively through their operating area, which the PLA calculates as a political win demonstrating sovereignty assertion, or respond in a way that creates an international incident involving what are, on paper, civilian fishing boats, which the PLA calculates as a larger political win demonstrating American aggression against civilians. It is a genuine dilemma. It is clever. It was designed by serious people who thought carefully about the specific constraints of American rules of engagement, international maritime law, and the political costs of various response options. What it was not designed to account for is that USS Benfold had been here before, 11 times in 18 months. The SLQ-32 had been collecting against this specific formation's equipment fit and command net since March. The formation's behavioral pattern, deployment geometry, maneuvering response to course alterations, communication timing, had been analyzed, documented, and incorporated into the 7th Fleet contact profile that every destroyer in the area carried as standard intelligence load. The 43 vessels were not surprising. They were not alarming. They were, from the perspective of the Combat Information Center, practically familiar. The commanding officer had a classified briefing document on this specific unit that was more detailed than anything the unit's own command structure had probably assembled about itself. At 7:47, the lead ARC made its definitive maneuvering statement. 7 of the 9 vessels turned to close intervals, forming a line-ahead formation across USS Benfold's projected track at approximately 1.8 nautical miles. The geometry was unambiguous. This was not fishing. This was a barrier. The AIS transponders continued to broadcast commercial fishing codes. The bridge-to-bridge radio continued its catch coordination theater. A net was briefly deployed from one of the vessels, not into the water, just extended over the rail visible from the bridge, a prop in a performance that had been running for 4 years in this theater. The officer of the deck observed this. He logged it. He noted the net. He noted the specific angle at which it was extended, which was not the angle of a net being prepared for use and was exactly the angle of a net being displayed for a camera. He called this out to the CIC with the professional tone used to report weather observations. On the weather deck, a boatswain's mate who had been completing a line maintenance task on the port side looked up at the vessel closest to him, approximately 800 yards, close enough to see the crew on the bridge watching USS Benfold with binoculars. He looked at the vessel for a moment. He looked at the net draped over the rail. He looked at the absence of any fishing equipment actually in the water. He raised one hand in a wave that contained, without any words, an entire editorial opinion. Then he went back to his line work. It was good line work. The vessel deserved neither his full attention nor his alarm. USS Benfold altered course 5 degrees to starboard. Not away from the formation, through the southern gap in the outer arc, the corridor between the outermost vessels and the territorial sea boundary, a gap that was present because the formation had not yet closed it, and closing it would require the outer arc vessels to cross in front of USS Benfold's bow at a distance that the navigation rules of the road, the same international maritime law that protects civilian vessels, would classify as creating a collision risk, which creates a different kind of documentation problem for whoever caused it. The 5-degree course alteration was a technical statement made in the language of navigation law, and it said, "We see your formation. We have documented it. We have classified it. We are transiting in accordance with international law, and the next maneuvering decision is yours." The outer arc vessels held their positions. The Benfold passed through the corridor at 11 knots. The lead arc adjusted, trailing. By 8:03, the formation was 2.2 nautical miles aft and opening. By 8:15, it was 5 nautical miles aft. By 8:30, it was hull down on the horizon. The commanding officer stood at the CIC display watching the cluster recede. He had said approximately 40 words in the last hour and 4 minutes. The situation had not required more. "What's the final intel package?" "Complete, sir. Updated formation order of battle, 3 new vessel IDs, 2 upgraded radar fit profiles, command net transmission pattern updated across 43 vessels, 4 months of behavioral analysis confirmed against this morning's data. EW officer assesses we now have enough command net metadata to geolocate the formation's shoreside control node within approximately 150 meters. A brief pause. "We also have footage of a fishing net that was never deployed into the water, which the intelligence team describes as, quote, the most unambiguous piece of performance art they have documented since May." The commanding officer allowed a 3-second silence that was the closest he got to laughing on watch. "Forward everything to 7th Fleet. The net footage, too." He went back to his cabin. He had a command chronology to write, a 7th Fleet contact report to file, and a request to submit for recognition of the SPS-73 maintenance team, who had completed their calibration in 9 minutes rather than the standard 12, a detail that had appeared nowhere in any after-action report because no one had calculated the geometry until approximately 7:31. The recognition request would note professional excellence. It would not note the specific 3 minutes that professional excellence had produced. Some operational details are best acknowledged quietly. The cost accounting for the morning. USS Benfold had altered course once by 5 degrees for approximately 4 minutes. It had not deviated from its freedom of navigation track corridor. It had not elevated its threat condition. It had not fired anything or employed any system in an active mode that the formation was not already tracking. The intelligence package produced by the morning's encounter would require approximately 60 hours of analysis at Fifth Fleet and Pacific Fleet combined, which at government contractor billing rates for intelligence analysis represents an investment significantly exceeding the operational costs of the encounter itself. This is either a compelling argument for reducing collection ambitions or a compelling argument for the value of the data, depending on which line of the budget you are responsible for. In Beijing, by mid-afternoon, the state media apparatus had assembled a narrative. The People's Liberation Army Navy had conducted a successful sovereignty assertion operation in Chinese territorial waters. The South China Sea is, in Beijing's official geographic taxonomy, Chinese territorial water, in the same way that the moon is, in various historical claims, property of whoever planted a flag on it, demonstrating the resolve of the Chinese people to defend their maritime rights against foreign encroachment. The operation had forced the American vessel to alter course. The American vessel's course alteration of 5 degrees for 4 minutes was, in the narrative, a retreat. The footage of the formation, filmed from the militia vessel's own cameras and cleared for release, was impressive. 43 vessels in coordinated formation, a visual demonstration of organized maritime presence that was genuinely striking as photography regardless of its strategic outcome. USS Benfold's deck log for the morning read, 7:22 to 8:30. Maritime militia formation, 43 vessels engaged in documented presence operation. Conducted freedom of navigation operations per standard track. No deviation from authorized corridor. Formation classification achieved 7:29. 1 course alteration, 5 degrees starboard, 4 minutes, for navigation geometry. Formation aft and opening 8:03, 48 words. The incident report was 6 pages, most of which was the intelligence annex. 6 pages would be read by approximately 40 analysts and 7 flag officers over the next 72 hours. The Beijing media narrative would be seen by approximately 40 million people before lunch. Both documents describe the same morning. Neither description would be useful to the other side. Here is what did not appear in the Beijing narrative. The updated order of battle. The 2 upgraded radar fit identifications. The command net transmission pattern that now permitted 150-meter geolocation of the shoreside control node. The 4 months of behavioral analysis that had converted the formation's maneuvering doctrine into a predictive model accurate enough to have anticipated this morning's approach geometry within 3 degrees. The fact that the next time this formation deployed, every U.S. Navy destroyer in the 7th Fleet would have this morning's intelligence package loaded as a current threat file, and the classification timeline would be cut from 7 minutes to approximately 90 seconds. The 43 vessels had come to create a dilemma. They had also, by showing up with the same command net, the same formation doctrine, and 3 new vessels with upgraded radar fits, provided the resolution to several questions the Pacific Fleet intelligence community had been holding since March. They had transited in from Sanya, conducted a 4-hour operation, and transited out, having accomplished both the tasked mission, assert presence, document course alteration, and an untasked bonus mission, update the U.S. Navy's contact file on their own formation at no additional cost to either party. The boatswain's mate completed his line work at 8:20. He had not thought about the formation since the wave. The line was good work and deserved his full attention, which it received. The 43 vessels returned to Sanya. Their catch report, filed with the Hainan Province Maritime Authority, listed 12 tons of mixed reef fish. The South China Sea's reef fish population had no comment. Both accounts of the morning are real in their own way. One will be cited in the next sovereignty briefing in Beijing. The other will be loaded onto every Arleigh Burke in the Western Pacific by Thursday. Guess which one changes anything about the next freedom of navigation operation? Bye for now.